Bridan, tell us a little bit about how you got into this work and how you've created your own style with working with people.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to really cliff notes this because it's a much longer arc. But basically, I started out as a portrait and figure artist in my head. And educationally, I was in anatomy and dissection because I wanted to become Michelangelo. But in the portrait and figure artist side of things, I was one day at a company that they hired people with special needs as employees. And three or four of them were stocking a shelf. And I watched their behavior and I thought, wow, every one of them has facial distortion and they can barely stock a shelf. And just the thought occurred to me, human performance is linked to symmetry, which we know that instinctively, but it was just kind of glaring. And so I thought, wow, so I wonder what area of our healthcare system changes facial symmetry. Because if the brain is not symmetrical, it seems like in looking around in life that matches with how well people do. And come to find out, there was none. There's craniofacial surgery, where they saw your face off, but that's not healthcare. That's like a massive procedure to fix a massive distortion or really big issues. There's nothing that was dealing with slight issues. There's cranial osteopathy, which makes micro adjustments, and there's craniosacral, which makes even smaller. They're not making adjustments; they're flowing fluid. So, long story short, I dove in thinking we could only change infants, and because adults' heads were too further progressed, they were too interdigitated in the sutures. However, I met a guy out of Australia, Bob Walker, who was adjusting skulls. He just couldn't get them to hold. He would make an adjustment and the face would change. And then he would try to shore up the system with light wire dental appliances. Um, and that was intriguing to me, but there was no one at the time in surrounding states. The closest person was Las Vegas that was doing anything like that, dental wise. And so I was sending patients so I studied under him for 4 years. And I was sending patients 600 miles to Vegas to finish the case, which was ridiculous. That's not sustainable. So, long story short, I later figured out the pieces that were missing in his model and kept adding and innovating and came to realize where the key unlocking pieces of the skull were, where we can really make dramatic cranial change even without adjustment, with removing original trauma from the system or um, correcting asymmetries from birth or intrauterine issues, but most of it's from concussions or the like that we just collect along the way. And especially in early childhood, where someone can get hit and they cry for half an hour, mom dusts them off and sends them on their way. Those things can be really consequential. And we don't realize the cascade of effect. And I didn't realize it until correcting it and then seeing massive human change in performance. And that translates down to something you are a specialist in is autonomics, where we see the autonomic nervous system actually change when you remove the insults that have happened to the system or when we align it.
Amazing. Yeah, so it sounds like you really have made a connection, and we've most of us, at least in this field, have heard this idea of structure and function are related. You could say structure informs function, and when we have optimalized structures, we are going to have increased levels of function. And when we're talking in autonomics and in the brain, we're talking about this brain, and it sits inside of our skull, it sits inside of our cranium. And that brain then communicates down and through the body, and the body communicates back up and through. And so tell us a little bit about the kind of changes or shifts that you're seeing through your work that affect that level of change? Like when you see a change in bringing integrity, or you could say alignment, to the different planes of the face, what kind of changes and shifts are you commonly seeing?
In order to answer your question, I'm going to peel back two more layers,
Great.
because to understand that is to understand why is the body in a compromised state in the first place. There are two major categories of nerves in the body. There are spinal-based nerves and cranial-based nerves. Spinal-based are coming off the cord, and cranial are coming right off the central nervous system, off the brain, off the brainstem. And the body can mitigate pain, turn it on, turn it off as need at will. And it's a whole nother topic, coming off the spinal cord. However, cranial nerve pain is a totally different monster. We cannot turn off those signals. And pain all runs through one common nucleus, trigeminal nucleus. And there's basically triage centers where the body says, what is it that hurts? How important is this? What are we going to do about it? And do we let the cortex know? Does the person consciously know that this is actually happening? And so a lot of pain is managed by lower centers. We don't even know what's going on. And things in the nature of reflexes are the same. So an example of spinal nerve pain that you turn off is when you've been out biking or hiking and you look down and you found dried blood on your leg. You didn't even know you were injured. Your body got injured and never even let you know. Versus a toothache. You can't turn that off. It hurts so bad. You're not waiting till March till your insurance kicks in. You're getting it taken care of yesterday. And that's because that's off of a cranial nerve. So cranial nerve pain, toothache, we can't do anything about. That's dental. However, other cranial nerve pain that does affect how we move and how we carry ourselves is off of jaw joint, and upper neck are the two main ones. There's also cranial sutural pain and a number of other places in the skull. But the two biggest issues that we see, one of them is right around where you're operating, is base of the skull, top of the neck. Mm-hmm. And so when you have, let's say, something happens to the skull and the jaw joint, the joint is actually put into a compromised position, and that distortion will slightly also move the eyes in the skull. Now, this nervous system is based to make us survivable. So when the eyes are not properly placed, the body says, whoa, hold the phone. Everything needs to bow to survivability. I need depth perception. So it will contort the head to get oncoming life proper. And then it will say, oh, in that position, I'm getting pain in my jaw because the TMJ joint, has more pain receptors concentrated than anywhere else in the body. So then the body will say, okay, I'm now got depth perception. My eyes are level with the horizon. Oh, if I move like this, now the jaw is pulled out of the socket just slightly, so it's not banging on the pain receptors. But then the shoulders are off, and then the hips are off, and then the feet are off, and the whole thing, the chain goes all the way down. So when people stand in the mirror and actually see where they're standing, there are very few humans out there that are aligned. And it's because of these lower issues that then you add 10,000 steps a day, plus gravity, plus time, all that use, and you end up with symptoms over time that are really debilitating to humans. Mm-hmm. You end up pushing a walker around the mall when you're 70 with tennis balls on it. That's the progression of gravity winning from these reflexes and these pain patterns. However, when we correct the distortion of the central nervous system, all of a sudden the human uprights. They don't need to be doing exercises to stand in a proper position. They don't need to be working out to turn their core on. All of a sudden, it turns on when you take out the insult that the system was managing that you didn't even know was in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I think could be a great lead into your initial assessment, and give a sense of how, like you just explained beautifully, how this chain of an initial insult and then you could call it like a riding reflex to like keep those eyes, in a way that they can perceive the world correctly so that you're survivable, and how that distortion chain is affecting them all the way down to the toes. Give a little bit of a sense of how you can spot these patterns and then how then you work to unfold those and make those corrections.
My goal in the initial assessment is to find out why are the shoulders, the hips, the feet doing what they're doing without actually doing anything to the shoulders and the hips and what have you. By, I'll call them party tricks. I go through and evaluate neuro reflexes and motor reflexes. And through party tricks, we can flip a signal to go from having it sending the signal to not having sending the signal. It only holds for 3 or 5 minutes, but that's enough time for us to put these pieces in place. And when we find the signals that are improperly, or rather, I should say, that are properly firing, but are improperly distorting the system, when we find those and we turn them off, all of a sudden the person uprights. So what I want to do is have them, just by turning off motor reflexes and neuroreflexes, just by playing some tricks on the system, all of a sudden the system goes and everything lines up. And then I go, all right, there is your Christmas list of what we've got to take care of. And sometimes it's not complete. Sometimes it's just 2, 3, 4 things. And once we take care of that, then it's much clearer if there's anything underlying. But if somebody has 6 issues going on, not necessarily structural, even biochemical or psycho-emotional, that is a very complex layering. And sometimes they don't even know. They'll know 1 or 2 of those. And when they go to a provider, they're saying this hurts and that hurts. The provider is looking and trying to, it's so complex having so many things going on that they can't get to the root cause. So I have a really effective system created to determine the structural issues. And when we turn that off, then we have a very clear picture of where that person's at.
Wow, great.
And that's actually, it's really fast. You can run through that in 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I've seen you do it repeatedly.
Yeah.
And it's pretty mind-blowing. I mean, we have our way of quickly assessing like whether autonomics are inbounds or out of bounds. And I've seen you be able to walk in and just see kind of the longer game of where those distortions have increased the degenerative impulse of that being out of balance in a way that, you know, we see that there is typically an initial impact or violation or trauma that causes the body to go into response, and due to our modern circumstances, the autonomics are not able to get that. Everything is okay. We can kind of come back to center again. So then we continue to be in a distorted, out of bounds pattern that then requires kind of what you're seeing. In order to stay functional, there's a number of compensatory things that start to occur within the system all the way down the chain to the toes, that you seem to be able to read and assess, okay, these are sort of the patterns, and this is where the structure has gotten itself into a pattern or a jam where it's really holding this pattern, and it's in where we're addressing at the very top and going, okay, we're liberating you from the pattern. If a joint has been holding this thing and there's tissue to support that and there's distortion in the musculoskeletal system, there's other things that can be addressed. And that's what I'm loving our collaborative work, is that we're able to kind of unlock the patterns, and then you're able to go like ching ching ching, like let's make these additional the buildups and the support platforms that are created within the body to support the distortion that are actually just trying to calibrate you to survivability. Now you're going, well, since we can get the autonomics balanced, let's decrease the distortion, bring about greater alignment on all levels, and watch the function go through the roof. So explain more about that.
So, and there are 2 parts to that. The first one, there are 2 phases that the autonomic nervous system can be in. One is health and vitality, and the other is breakdown, or we call it dystrophy. Mm-hmm. And so through the infantile reflexes and motor reflexes and neuroreflexes, through some just, we'll call it tricky Tetris, nervous system Tetris, of figuring out where these things stack, we can figure out really rapidly what phase that person is in. If your nervous system, if you're feeling like you're not healing, you're sensitive to light, dark, driving at night, is rough, loud noises, you don't like crowds, one or all of those things, those are classic signs that the nervous system is in trouble. And it's basically changed gears over into a skeletal crew while it manages all of the items on your list that are happening that it's having to manage to keep you survivable. So my first job, I'll call it, is to get the system out of emergency mode if it is in emergency mode and into a healing mode. And then once we're in a healing mode, then everything changes. And that we can test that out. And by the little party tricks, we can turn that off in an evaluation meeting and all of a sudden see the body literally change right in front of you. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. But that's also where, when we do the corrections, the first goal, if the person is in trouble, we get them out of trouble. So by getting the nervous system into a healing phase, then you don't age so quickly. So often people in that phase say, yeah, I feel like the last 2 years I've just been going downhill. Well, you have. That's the truth of it. But the good news is that's not a one-way valve. We can flip that back and actually have the system go back into a vital, strong mode. Strong, actually a change in the physical strength. So even in an evaluation appointment where we just use these tricks to turn things off, I've seen people's physical strength with a grip test changed by even 100%. 10, 20, 15, 25% is really regular. But I've seen it double, because once you take and turn off these things that the body's trying to manage around, all of a sudden it goes, oh, I can use all the power that I've got, or I can use a bigger portion of it. So this comes into human performance where, especially a performance athlete, they know their times. And man, if we make a couple of corrections and all of a sudden give them 15 extra percent of strength, that's podium or not. That's a big change. And you don't have to be a performance athlete. Just going through life going, wow, I feel balanced and I'm not fighting my body to stand up anymore. I hear that so often. They don't even know that they are. Yeah. And once we change the phase and all of a sudden they stand up, they're like, wow, I'm balanced. I didn't know it. Like, this is so much easier to stand up, because all of a sudden it's not in emergency mode. Yeah. And so that's a piece of that where you don't realize how warm the soup has gotten. You're in that pot and it keeps warming you up and you're getting cooked. And because it's happened so slowly, you don't realize what's going on until someone actually gives you data. And so I back up the physical motor reflex tests and such that I do with computer analysis, because I want more than just my subjective test to be pointing the direction. I want 2 or 3 arrows all saying this is what's going on. And when everything points that way, then I'm like, all right, that's where we're at. We will eliminate the guesswork.
I love that. And I love too that what I found is that there's, same in my work, and I can use myself as a testimony to this, is like I'm pretty high functioning. I don't have pain or chronic degeneration, and yet what I found is that this working with you changed. I have massive change and increase in airflow, respiratory function. There was pieces that structurally were so buried, and I think my body been doing a really fantastic job of compensating for those things. And so, it's almost unperceivable, but you were able to like pull those out. And I've worked with, top level Olympic athletes, Olympic gold medalists, 100-mile ultra marathon runners that are the top of their game, PGA golfers. And even these guys who are working at that level, through our simple autonomic testing, is like, and you're structurally, your body is out of balance, in a state of accelerated degeneration. And even though they're performing at the top of their game, at the top of the level for the world, when we make these changes, they get a boost. And so there's this idea of how this is going to be effective, whether you're in a state of degeneration and disease or you're at a very high level of function, maybe even the best in your game or your world or your thing, and that these little changes especially in that, well, I think not throughout the entire system, but in the cranium and in the sinuses and in these places that are, when they come into plumb, it is like there is a noticeable shift that is, it doesn't matter whether you're in a state of significant dis-ease or you are at the top of your game.
Yeah. And what's really fun is working on people that are that tuned, they immediately know, like they see the change throughout the whole system.
Hmm.
But you can do a lot through really clean eating, through great hydration, through great sleep. But if you're not getting air, all that's it's marginal.
Hmm.
The good news is that has built a strong system. But part of the process of this alignment piece is straightening the septum and having increased nasal airway. So then we get better nitric oxide. And you tune that, you put that piece in, and you improve airway by 10, 15, 40%. It's a game changer.
Yeah. You mentioned to me, and I know this to be true, is in the sense that most people don't know that inside of their sinus, I believe there's 17 unique types of tissue, and it's very similar to like our erogenous tissues of the
Yeah.
genitals. They can expand and contract significantly based on the information. So most people think of breath as, oh, I'm getting air, right? Well, breath is so much more than that. It is the air, it's the energy, the ions, it's picking up so many signals that are so beyond our conscious perception. But when you open those sinus canals and they're able to get the signals more fully and trigger the tissue to inform our brain, but also getting that direct airflow to the hypothalamus, which is able to then communicate with the pituitary and pineal gland, which changes the entire cascade of physiology and hormones throughout our system. We're talking game-changing
Yeah.
shifts.
Yeah. And part of that, so people that have compromised nasal airway, if it's compromised enough, they have to use the mouth. They're not even using their nose, which that's a whole nother level of heart stress.
Right.
But if they are using their nose, the largest area is lower. However, the most important area for breathing is upper.
Hmm.
And the pituitary gland, which is your master governor over hormones, operates most efficiently when it's 2 degrees cooler than everything around it. It's in the middle of the brain. The only way to get that pituitary gland 2 degrees cooler is to cool the room underneath it, which is called the sphenoidal sinus. And the only way to do that is to get upper nasal airway passage. You've got to get air going up and in.
Hmm.
And another track on that is nitric oxide. This upper area is rich with nitric oxide production. So if we don't have passage going up and through those upper turbinates, upper nasal air passages, we're compromised with nitric oxide. And as you age, nitric oxide becomes a much more important chemical in the body.
Hmm.
There's so much data about that. I mean, you take away nitric oxide and you have hypertension in 10 days. Like it is 1-to-1 on the heart. And erection quality for men and sex drive and hormones. Like there's so many pieces to this pie. But if you've been warmed in that soup and slowly being cooked by these systems slowly getting worse and getting more contorted and more blocked off in the airway, you don't realize until it's critical. And the number of people that have, after some work, said, "Oh, I didn't know I couldn't breathe before. I'm getting so much more air." Not only through a better passage in the nose and in the pharynx, because once we turn off the reflexes, the head comes up, and your pharynx that used to be round, when the head's forward, is no longer ellipses. That is not a great airway.
Hmm.
But there's this other quality of the central nervous system, of the autonomics, that when we tune the lower brain centers and when we tune that space and those turn on better and the autonomics drop tone, the ability to take a full breath changes, which that's so fascinating to me. And to watch people go, and sometimes in the medical background, we'll ask the question is of how well are you able to take a deep breath? And it's really surprising the number of people who will report that that has gone downhill,
Mhm.
that that's compromised. And then we see that turn back on. And I mean, you need air. And if there's only a couple places you can get it in your body, and if those are compromised, how are you oxygenating your brain? And if
Mhm.
you're living at a suboxygenated body, like, my gosh, the studies and the research on that, and then we go into sleep, airway, sleep apnea, central apnea, obstructed breathing,
Mhm.
hypopnea. That is, those are for the most part structurally based. Even central apnea, which is a message where the brain tells the body not to breathe in the middle of the night. It's not being obstructed; it's being given a bad signal. That has been really fascinating to watch that even change.
Mhm.
So there is just such a cascade on the this system being in a properly shaped, properly toned case
Mhm.
that yeah, it's just so exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I can say as 25 years of being extremely dedicated breath worker and 22 years of facilitating breathing and extensive amounts of yogic practices, doing pranayama and everything else, I thought I breathe pretty well. I kind of always felt like I must have narrow sinus passageways, but hey, I can work this thing and I'm doing great. It was about 8 months ago that I had my first experience with you, and it was like all of a sudden a rocket ship, like the amount of like, imagine I was like getting like, 87 octane air fuel and all of a sudden it went to like way over 100, and I'm like, I didn't know this was possible. I didn't know I could get this kind of airflow through these sinuses. And having experienced being a very high level athlete myself, through high school, playing water polo at a high level, got my nose broken multiple times. And the very first session, I knew that I unbroke my nose in 2 ways, and that changed my life. And I'm still reaping the benefits. It's one of the things that I also um, think is so valuable is that so many things like when people are out there at the edge treating effects, what I call effects are symptoms,
Yeah,
then they, if you just suppress one symptom, they pop up somewhere else. This work has given me lasting results. Like
yeah,
it's not changed. It's not gone back. Like my nose is still
yeah.
straighter and my sinus canals are blasted open in a way that has changed the game for me in my respiratory function.
You know what's so exciting to me is that the by us working together, what I've seen is these effects of my work are 2 to 3 fold more. I won't say more effective. They're faster to get to that point.
Mhm.
So when people have had your work or are having your work in conjunction with mine, that's been blowing my mind the
Yeah.
last 8 months. Just to see that, because what you're describing is the exciting part of this is we're doing this without surgery, without drugs, without major like procedures,
Yeah. Not invasive
and
at all, really.
and it holds.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that just I as I innovated this over the past 25 years, I didn't want to do anything that was like, oh, that's only temporary. If
Yeah.
I figured something out and it was only temporary, that was on the top of my list to then hack and understand why was that only temporary? What was the root cause that thing was unraveling?
Mhm.
And that's really exciting, is to get to the place where when people come back in, they haven't seen me in a year or 6 months, and they walk in the door and like, I'm better than last time I saw you. I'm like, yeah, that's because we got you past the tipping point.
Yeah.
And past that tipping point, you start to improve all on your own. And then we'll just come back in 6 months and we'll bump it into one more gear.
Yeah. That's that. Also, I love that there's this kind of seems like there's an infinite edge, like an infinity pool of possibilities as the system can always be fine-tuned a little bit more, and those airways can always deliver a little bit more effectively. It's the changes are massive and seems like to a degree, it's a bottomless well of how you can get everything into alignment and into plane together. And
Yeah.
as they come into plane, they play together. There's this
Yeah.
playing aspect of like life just gets a whole lot more fun in a body that's breathing really well, that isn't playing with a bunch of compensatory structural patterns that are compensating for the stress that you've been enduring and the traumas and impacts that you've taken on. We've
Yeah.
all had them, and that's another thing. Because I think a lot of people think, well, I'm not a boxer. I didn't get hit in the face a whole bunch, or haven't been in that many car accidents. And what I'm constantly amazed by is how all these little things in our lives, in our bodies, impact us. And so it's really important not to compare oneself to someone else and like, well, they might need it because they've been in a car accident, or they might need it because they had this. But everybody's body is playing out this sort of these games and these
Yeah.
dynamics because of the kind of world we're living in. It's like it's a beautiful world, but when you're in a stress state, it's a difficult world. It's a dog eat dog world. It's all these games that we
Yeah.
play when we're stuck in a primitive level of function, playing out big distortions in our body. It's all a mirror. And when you start to bring things into alignment and integrity and coherence, that ripples out into every aspect. I was blown away by
Yeah.
the impacts of the last time we worked together. Some folks called me a few weeks later, and it was their wife that was like, one of this gentleman, his wife said, I can't thank you enough, you and Bridan and Swirl, for what you've done, because I have not been able to sleep with my husband for 2 decades because his snoring and his it's just and it is like so obnoxious, and like he stops breathing and then comes back online. And she's like, since you guys worked with him those 2 times, I've slept with my husband for the first time every night, and he doesn't snore, and he's not doing this thing, and I'm just so grateful because like it's so important to me, but I couldn't sleep through the night with him, and now I can. Like,
Yeah.
what a gift, like an unknown benefit that was going to be delivered to this family. And that's like, you get that and you just get to go, I'm so blown away and happy for them.
Yeah. And there's a lot of value to think like he probably should have been in a CPAP
Right.
a long time ago. And there's a lot of value to tools like that. However, the CPAP was originally developed as a short-term device to be used for 3 to 6 months while while the issue was found and corrected.
Hmm.
However, that's not the financial model that ended up happening in our society.
Right.
So we have these people that are now reliant on this, I'll call them terrible, on this terrible device, because I haven't heard anybody say, oh, I love putting that thing on at night.
My wife loves it too because I look so great.
I know. However, it's saving lives.
Yeah.
And we can't fix everyone. There are certainly situations of airway that they just need those devices and it's saving their life. However, there are a lot of situations like his where we tune a couple things and all of a sudden the soft palate in the back that was dropped automatically just rises up and it opens up the pharyngeal space. And then they start getting air. And then the tongue that was so large from the struggle to try and get air in, you give that a few weeks of good sleep and that relaxes down. It becomes a normal sized tongue and it's no longer going back and blocking the airway. And
Hmm.
there's just such a cascade.
Hmm.
And this isn't the only, I mean, we've been talking about a lot of really incredible results. However, one of the exciting pieces for me is the people that this is not the primary thing on. And once we get the structure corrected, then we're able to see something else that was underlying.
Hmm.
Sometimes that's trauma, or that there all of a sudden we're able to see that there's a biochemical infection going on
Yeah.
that was hidden before. And when we remove or alleviate the big structural load, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I recognize that, and I can refer them to someone who can take care of a huge underlying piece that they didn't even know was in there before,
Yeah.
because the structural things were so loud, they were taking up all the airspace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've seen it, like you're speaking of too, sometimes our trauma patterns are not just structural. Thinking of another client that we worked with that had generational addiction and had just struggled on and off throughout their life for 40 years with this addiction. And somehow, in moving what we were moving structurally and physically, was able to sort of, you could say, like regurgitate this generational addict that was in there and see it for what it was. And that from that moment forward, like separated or was able to create discernment between what was just handed down and conditioned in versus who that person really was.
Yeah.
And since that day, they've been themselves, and they have been able to see that addiction in a completely different way, like coughing up a ghost and then being like, wow, that's not me. And that's been running my life and ruining my family for so long. I could barely remember who I was. And so there's something we could say, somatic psychosomatic about that, where there's something as
Yeah.
we change the somatic framework and structure, that sometimes part of our psychology or our psychosis can also get budged or nudged out of the system in a way that it hadn't been able to before.
I would have to call that, and I just came up with this on the fly, the parable of the browser tabs, because it, you can think of it as every one of these things we have going on is in the view of our system being treated as an operating system. There are all these browser tabs we have open, and the jaw pain may be occupying 120 browser tabs in the background, and the contortion from that causing neck issues taking on another 85, and you have then the cascade going into the hip and into the knee and into the foot, and those three combined together are another 85. And then there's the addiction that's in there, and but it's so clouded with all these other pieces that when we go in and we close 200, 300 browser tabs, all of a sudden there's space to go, oh my God, like I see myself differently now. I can comprehend the emotional trauma I went through, whatever. Like
Yep.
you see so many areas of the human change, like that perspective change. And this is Maslow's, if they're down into just barely managing at the bottom of the pyramid, they're not thinking about self-actualization.
Yeah.
But when we remove the threat and remove the strain of all these other pieces, and even if we don't get all of them, we're getting enough substantial core issues that the person is able to progress in other areas. It's fascinating to watch all of a sudden they're in a different relationship. They get out of an abusive relationship. They quit their addiction. They start therapy. All these things change because they're no longer just managing walking around.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't even know they were at that level to start with. They just know they felt bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful work.
Yeah. Well, I think that was amazing. So grateful for finding you, us finding each other, and this little trinity that we've created
Yeah.
in this world. And
Been so great.
excited to keep it up. Well, this has
Yeah,
been
you guys,
great.
I loved dovetailing our work together.
Yeah.
I didn't know until, again, this is like one of our patients. I didn't know what I was missing until I found you.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now it's like, oh my gosh, like the power of your correction in line with mine, it just makes my work so much faster and easier.
Yeah.
I'm not going around cleaning up all this stuff I've usually got to take care of right out of the gate. It's already done.
Yep. So good. Well,
Yeah.
this has been perfect and so grateful. And I'm really looking forward to our tour coming up, you and
Yeah.
sharing this work all over the country.
Thank you so much for your time and for setting this up. It's been
Yeah.
so good to talk together. We've
Awesome.
needed to do this for a while.
I know. This is perfect.
Thank you so much.
Hmm.